Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this latest edition of Tales from Outer Space. Hope you enjoy. Let Loose the Songs of War, written by JCB 112. My grandfather had once told me what music sounded like. He told me a great many things about the world before the Great Silence. A world of incredible sights and sounds. A world as vibrant in color as it was in its complexity of noise. A world that we had once ruled. A world that we held dominion. A world that us Elians would never be able to experience with our own senses for as long as our kind chooses survival over living. It was difficult to accept my grandfather's tales as anything but fiction. Perhaps this was why he was chosen, or rather, punished, to the life of the surface walker, doomed to live a short and brutal existence above the warrens as cattle and game for the invaders. The tales he regaled me with, the stories of his reality that was supposedly our past. It was too much for the elders to accept. It was deemed too dangerous to spread. For what use was there to fixate on the stories of the past, when the present and the future held no hope of reattaining it? It was better to be ignorant, better to know only what's necessary for continued survival, better to survive than be dead fool. It was better to be silent underground where the invaders could not hear us. I personally couldn't handle the thought of ever sacrificing my life for a simple tale. Grandfather's punishment as a surface walker was tantamount to execution, but it was necessary. Another necessary evil in this world we find ourselves in. For the invaders were never truly satisfied, and what they craved more than our lands, our histories, and our legacies was fresh meat and blood. They weren't satisfied in knowing that they had eliminated and humiliated us. They weren't happy with a mere victory. No, they wanted to continue their games for however long that may last. And most, if not all, of these games required Elian blood. They'd appear in large numbers after the thawing season, gathering supplies, equipment, materials, and otherworldly constructs too bizarre for any of us to truly comprehend, to set up temporary camps throughout the great prairies. More often than not, they'd miss our warrens and bunkers by a factor of a good few 100 miles. This was a constant reminder that we had in fact cracked the code of our survival. As by remaining silent, we remained hidden, and by remaining hidden, we remained safe. Yet, that couldn't last forever. Given enough time, the invaders could pierce through the dirt with their tools and machines. Given enough time, even the most careful of warrens could accidentally emit too much noise. And that's where the surface walkers come in. They were, for all intents and purposes, sacrifices for the invaders to both satisfy their bloodlust and bait to throw them off of the trail as best that they could. They would track as far as long as their legs could take them, journeying as far away from the bunkers as they could, all the while emitting as much noise and sound as was possible. They would scream into the void to make sure that any and all attention was on them, and not on us. Yet the invaders had taken this to a ritual of sorts, a sort of hunt. Grandfather had always told us that the machines and equipment they brought along weren't just weapons of war or tools of combat. No, a good chunk of the equipment was in fact meant exclusively for recording and broadcasting. When coupled with how they preferred to focus their attention on our surface walkers, he surmised that the invaders had long since forgotten their war of extermination and had now turned their hunts into a game which they broadcasted for more of their kind throughout the stars. This very idea sickened me to my core, but I could do nothing about it. When the time came to bid my grandfather goodbye, I, along with many others amongst the crowd, expected yet another silent and grim send-off. Yet, what I saw, what all of us saw, wasn't the sight of a defeated man, but instead one that was full of vigor and vitality of life. He stood in the mining shaft turned elevator with a look of absolute glee. One that most could have easily mistaken as the eyes of a madman. But I knew better. This was the look of my grandfather, at peace. And it was clear why this was the case. The elder seemed to have seen fit to release one of the many confiscated items back to the man, and sure enough, what I saw him cradling in his arms was none other than the family heirloom I'd heard so much about, yet had never ever even heard before. It was a strange-looking thing, a pouch-like bag with had several tubes sticking out from its belly, one that was placed firmly into my grandfather's maw as he locked eyes with me, and began bellowing. A deep thrum filled the caves, one that reverberated against every wall and alcove, filling the once desolate space with an uneasy gut-curdling thrum. This was followed by a shrill wailing sound, shifting in pitch and notes with a beauty that I simply could not describe. It transitioned between the two noises, the deep, dulcet drums and the sharp, shrilly wailing, and the walls of the bunker acting as an echo chamber, reverberating and thus blending the sounds together into something otherworldly. It stirred up something inside me, beckoning a part of me that I did not know still existed. It pulled to the forefront emotions and memories I'd suppressed for decades. The music lessons conducted in a hole in the wall, the harsh memorization of page after page of sheet paper after sheet paper, all of it culminating in an immensely underwhelming and unsatisfactory end of whispered hums, beats, and singing. Never anything like this, nothing so grand, nothing so beautiful. I understood now what my grandfather meant by the fact that our blood carried with it the spirit of a musician. For you could take the instruments, the sheet music, the lyrics and compositions away from the lyric, but you could never take away the music from a lyric. It was at that point that I knew I had to carry on the legacy. Screw the elders, screw the invaders. I couldn't let this part of us die. Not when I just tasted what we'd lost. The next decade consisted of me taking on the role my grandfather had committed himself to, teaching my own children and grandchildren behind hidden and sealed-off holes in the wall, attempting to imbue and inspire in them the same love and appreciation for the art form long since dead. Yet, it was becoming increasingly difficult by the year. The elders instituted bans and regulations more intense than ever before. Even talking was now done in hushed whispers and voices. There had been rumors that the elders had planned on teaching the next generation in exclusively sign language, to cut the noise entirely. It was under these conditions, and after being caught red-handed, that my time too had finally come. As I stood in the same position my grandfather had all those years ago, I held within my hands yet another part of the family collection, a flute. But unlike my grandfather, who had lived in the world before the Great Silence, I had little to no hands-on experience with the instrument. Playing it for the first time didn't elicit the same effect as I'd hoped, with even my own two ears being let down by the sounds that I was generating. It was with that and a final cursory glance to my children and grandchildren that I realized that I was perhaps the last to embrace this dying spirit of a decaying civilization. The world above was bright, far brighter than anything in the Warrens. I could see vast expanses of open fields in every direction with no distinguishing features or markers. I could also hear the rustling of leaves and the whistling of the wind, the sensation of the breeze on my bare skin for the first time in my life. However, as I moved forward, I could hear something else. It sounded like percussion, akin to the hollow noise that was generated by a wooden stick striking an empty tube. It played in near synchrony with the rustling of the winds. My first thoughts went to that later desire for hope. Perhaps there was indeed someone out here. Perhaps there was someone waiting for me. Maybe our underground warren was just a complete lie. I stopped in my tracks as soon as I discovered what it was that was generating that noise. It was a wind chime, constructed entirely by Alayan bones. I fell right on my backside, trying my best to hold back the last meal that I had from coming back up, before I sprinted in the opposite direction. Grandfather was right. This was a game, and I was now a running target. Minutes of sprinting soon turned into hours as my legs began to weaken, my body finally catching up to me and the adrenaline of my system finally dissipated. I ended up in yet another field, this sporting a hilly terrain and plenty of larger trees that I felt gave me more cover. A part of me felt that I'd made it out of there safely, and because I could not see nor hear any potential threats, that I was indeed in the clear. But I knew that it wasn't the case. The invaders didn't need to see you to hunt you down. They didn't need to track your footprints or comb over the tracks for clues. Not when they could hear your heartbeat from 100 miles in any direction. And with my running, huffing and puffing, it wouldn't be long before my time was up. At this point, I could feel part of me simply telling me to give up. Why run or take another step? Why entertain them when this is exactly what they wanted? Indeed, I was done with running, but I wasn't done with living just yet. I pulled out the flute, inspected its expert craftsmanship, admiring its build and design for what was perhaps one final time, before I began playing. I poured my heart into each and every note, huffing and puffing and daring and taunting the invaders to take me where I stood. To take me not with my tail between my legs, but on this literal hill where I intended to die. My cries for an honorable death were answered not a few minutes later, as I saw them, as my eyes would make contact with these hulking monstrosities that skulked on all fours and practically leapt towards my direction with terrifying speed. In the blink of an eye, they surrounded me, a literal sea of creatures that drowned out any discernible features of the land underneath their hulking bodies. So numerous were their numbers that they blanketed the landscape. Fear entered my heart, but I refused to relent, continuing my own assault, my own cry of defiance. I refused to stop playing, even as the largest of the horde approached me. Its face petals splayed open, its disgusting face mimicking our own species' smile with a terrifying degree of accuracy as it dropped something at my feet. A deflated bag with 4 tubes sticking out of its belly, coated in strange splotches of dried and crusty red residue. My heart dropped as I realized exactly what it was. As I realized now, I was quite literally walking in my grandfather's footsteps. The beast cackled at me, clicking and shifting its weight, and my music finally faded to nothing. I felt its claw reaching for my face. Crack! Everything stopped, my heart skipping a beat as the beasts around me seemed to wail and whine in confusion and panic. I looked up into the skies towards the direction of the strange sound, squinting my eyes to determine just what caused it. Crack! There it was again. Crack! More and more of these noises, but not a single hint of what was causing it. Then whistling. Then boom! I felt the very air that surrounded me solidifying, hurling me off my feet. I could feel every last breath in my lungs forcibly squeezed out. I could even hear the force of the wind, the harsh, snarling, angry gale that had brought upon rains of topsoil and debris. Then all I heard was a sharp, high-pitched ringing, one that seemed to block out any and all sounds from the world as my eyes opened to the gaping maw of the invader just inches away from my face. A maw that was disconnected from any body or any head for that matter. As I struggled back to my feet, all I could see surrounding me was devastation on a scale that was impossible to comprehend. What had formerly been organized groups and packs of invader hunters, what had formerly been a brown and black scourge of the land, was now reduced to ash and debris. I could barely make out what was tree burnt to a crisp and what was the burnt-out husk of an invader. Astonishingly, the hill I stood on, the 5x5 foot outcropping I stood on top, was left practically untouched. My mind went through its motions, confused, perplexed, but most of all, completely rejected the world that I was now thrust into. A part of me wanted to laugh and rejoice in victory. Another part of me wanted just to close my eyes, hoping to wake back up in the warren. But that confused, shocked joy didn't last forever. I heard something, a cackling, a series of clicks that were just buried deep within the piles of dead invaders. Then a sudden pop, followed by a sharp cry of pain. One of them had survived, and its locked eyes with me and its face petals angled towards my direction. It took a few steps back, my legs wobbling, trembling, but there was nowhere to run to, nowhere to even hide. I was a Durrar in the headlights, so the creature hobbled its way towards me, its front legs battered and bruised, its hind legs burnt to a crisp. Yet despite all of its grievous injuries, it was still faster than me. I knew nothing could save me now. Nothing short of a miracle. Nothing short of the divine intervention that had been exploding air not a few moments ago. There was nothing left to do but pray. And so I did. I closed my eyes, hoping this was all a dream, hoping, praying, begging. Then I heard it, the distant roar of some unknown beast echoing off the far in the distance, followed by a hard thumping, a thumping that grew louder and louder and louder still, until I realized it wasn't the thumping of the creature's hooves or the thrums of a bellowing monstrosity, but in fact, music. The invader in front of me seemed to recoil at the sound, its face petals flaying and its body tensing at the mere sound of what was approaching. Yet the sounds grew louder still. I could hear the distant tune of a beat that consistently played at 100 beats per minute. Instruments I'd never even conceived of. Some sounded like the strings my grandfather had described, others like the woodwinds I'd used, but others, there was a sharp richness to it that I couldn't pin down. All of it, however, was punctuated by the angelic singing of some otherworldly creature. The invader seemed to recoil further with every passing moment. Its sprint towards me had turned into a slow crawl as it desperately attempted to block out as much of the noise as possible. As the sounds got closer and closer still, I also heard something else. The roaring of machinery. Something that I hadn't heard since my early childhood, when the last fuel-driven motors were shut down permanently. But it wasn't just a lone motor, or two, or even 3 or 4, but a whole pack of them. They revved in unison, echoing the music that was blasting on full, as the cracking of metal on suspension could likewise be heard. It was then, and only then, that I saw it. Hulking beasts of metal, some 3 to 4 times taller than myself, all covered in drab olive or a dull grey with strange star-like symbols painted on all over them, all moving forward, following a smaller beast which housed what seemed to be people inside. It was clear that the entire pack was following their smaller leader, as the music was clearly emanating from the focal point. The whole pack came to a stop just about 100 feet from where I stood. There, I'd finally clasped my ears shut from all the noise. The ringing finally dissipated, exposing my sensitive ears to the true power of these creatures. Their very presence generated a noise that was actually hurting me by virtue of simply being in close proximity to me. At this point, the invader was barely even twitching. The only evidence of its life force was the shrill cries of pain that it consistently bellowed out. Sometime between the shock and the pain one of the smaller creatures from within the pack had approached me, handing me a strange device that resembled two cups connected via a headband. I stared at the creature warily, tentatively, my hands trembling as I reached for the strange device, and saw that the creature in front of me was doing. He was gesturing for me to put it on my head, on top of both my ears. I did so, knowing that angering such creature wasn't the best idea. And after all was said and done, the noise was gone. Silence finally returned to me as I praised the ancestor for this respite. It was then, and only then, that I pulled out a strangely shaped object, a piece of oddly shaped metal that had pointed towards the crippled invader and bang! Ended its suffering. My whole body recoiled from that. The noise from that thing. I dared not imagine what it would sound like without the aid of these ear cups. Testing, 1, 2, 1, 2, check. Elaine, can you understand me? Her voice suddenly addressed me from inside the metal cups, which almost prompted me to take them off. If not for a stern looking by the creature in front of me. Yes, I can. I managed to out meekly, eliciting a toothy smile from the creature. Good. Well then, son, I take it that you've got quite a shock from all of that. Yes, I'm still trying to understand. Still in awe at the entire situation, huh? There was a series of disappearing stares from the other creatures present, ranking the principal creature, as if they were actual pain from the choice of words their leader had used. Where are my manners? I am Lieutenant Colonel Elliot Porter, commander of the 1st Armored Battalion, 1st Pathfinders of the United Nations Forward Expeditionary Force. I could only nod in understanding. The very concept of a functioning military after the Great Silence was more alien than even the aliens themselves. What are you? We are humans, more specifically humanity's sword and shield, and we're here to help. Humans? I've never heard of a creature with a name such as yours, with abilities such as yours, with technologies that defy the common conventions. Common conventions, your tools, your weapons, everything you have exposes you to being detected by the invaders. Yeah? And you care not? Why should we? By being so blatant with your presence, you're exposing yourself to the dangers posed by those invaders. Yep. But the invaders, they're terrifying, unrelenting hunters by nature. Precisely. There's a difference between a hunter and a soldier, Elaine. The former stalks, creeps, hides in shadows waiting to strike. The latter shows up in your face and shoots you where you stand, without fear, without question. The former fights to survive, nor fights for sport. The latter fights for a cause, fights for something greater. And to that end, the latter has the support of 100 billion taxpayers supporting the military-industrial complex that can supply enough ships, planes, bombs, and shells to blow up 100,000 planets to kingdom come. The human claimed he wasn't a hunter. Yet the toothy grin he was currently displaying proved to me that this was anything but the case. Regardless, I relented. The facts spoke for themselves. The dead bodies of the untold mass of invaders was proof enough. Now we have a whole continent to clear up before dinner. Boys in the sky are already bombing the rest of the continent to hell and back, but we were sent here to mop up and occupy. However, I've been watching you and your antics there, son. You and your flute there. He pointed to the flute still held in my vice grip. You did us a solid by gathering the invaders up into one neat little cluster, but made it easy target from above. And I know you probably want some level of payback, considering all that's been done to your kind. So why don't I return the favor to you now? Again, the grin prompted me to nod and agree with his proposal, even before I heard it. Good, come on, get in. You're riding shotgun with me. It was with that I got into the metal beast, onto one of the seats, and I felt the world suddenly rush by me as it accelerated to the speed I refused to believe was real. So here's the plan. You saw how disoriented the invaders get when we blast the LRAD. LRAD? I parroted back, finally finding my own voice as the human nodded. The long-range acoustic device, the music you heard before we arrived. Yes? Well, it's not just for show. Well, honestly, it kind of is. Gotta say, it's been a blast playing some classic tunes for the sake of something other than morale boosting. But yeah, the invaders, as you know, hunt and excel at tracking and eliminating targets by their naturally sensitive audio-sensory organs.
Yes, this is why my civilization has retreated underground, eschewed most forms of our prior technologic civilization, and maintained what we needed to survive.
Yeah, well, suffice to say that I've heard that from 10 other species across 100 other planets, so you folks aren't alone. Anyways, you saw what happened to that one survivor, right? Tens of clicks before we arrived, the Owlrat had already messed with it enough to render it barely functional. That's generally our IMO. We go in, blast the Owlrat with our track of choice, and we mop up basically unchallenged. My eyes slowly lit up as I realized the implications of the human's explanation.
Go on.
Well, you know how we get to choose whatever track we want to play on this Owlrat?
A grin began to form on the edges of my maw. Yes, I recall.
Well, that also works for live audio, provided the audio has consistent stream of sound to it. And, well, he pointed at my flute, how's about we have some of your people's tunes? That's the last thing these feckers have to hear. I began to actually cackle. The absolute ridiculousness of the situation wasn't lost on me, but the revelation of my grandfather's demise, playing the bagpipes until the last moment, made the whole thing feel poetic, in a sense. A final act of justice.
You needn't say any more, friend. You needn't say another word. But I would like to ask,
go on,
how long until the next target?
The human chuckled, 2 cackling grins practically harmonizing in chorus. 10 minutes.
Then let us loose the songs of war, human. Let us serenade the ending of an era.
In front of us was a mountain, atop of it, and dotted all along the seemed to be structures of immense size and scale. I would have recoiled in terror from it if I wasn't for the human sitting right next to me. Similar to moments prior, the world before us was struck by unknown assailants from the heavens, and the ground before us shook with a fury that caused the earth around us to visibly ripple. It twisted, it turned, shuddering at sheer terror at the ferocity of the human's assault. Moments later, as the ash and dust finally settled, the mountain that had stood before us was as vast complexes it had been host to, was no more than a mound of ash and fine dirt. It is not over yet. Look, the human spoke, pointing towards the groups of invaders crawling out of what was left of the exposed rock. All right, seems like we've got a lot of work to cut out for us, sir. Go a-layin'. He handed me a strange device, placing it in front of my flute. Show them what you got. I closed my eyes. A surface walker was supposed to act as bait. And, with a deep inhale, a surface walker was supposed to draw as much attention away from their warren as possible. I took my flute. A surface walker wasn't expected to live, and played. But here I was. End of story. I would just quickly like to thank the T5 channel members and patrons. Caspar Arnholtz, Cam Maxwell, Barky, It's Difficult to Pronounce, Lord Azrakal, and Arcadian.